The next and potentially most important, second probably to the primary backup service component is this management service. So the management service, if I use the analogy of, let's use the analogy of a police precinct, okay? So we've got a chief of police, and this is the Metalogic SharePoint Backup Management Service. He's going to get requests from the console, i.e., let's say someone calls in that something happened. They need a backup, for instance. He's then going to connect to the primary backup service to initiate these operations, and the primary can kind of be considered his chief lieutenant. So he sends that operation to the primary backup service, and then that gets delegated from there. The management service can run on any workstation, and he has to be running in order to execute scheduled jobs. So in other words, if I have a scheduled backup that backs up data on servers X, Y, and Z over time, every night, every 2 hours, et cetera, this management service is the guy who's literally starting and sending those operation requests to the guys who need to do that, right? So he's basically the head honcho, the chief of police, so to speak. He starts the process after we give him a request. And then his other role is as a record keeper. He records data into our repository database. So all those backups that occur out in the field, he gets status about them, and then he records that status. Did it fail? Did it succeed? Et cetera, what's scheduled? When do I need to kick off a backup? When do I need to kick off an alert? And when do I need to start deleting stuff from the file system? So as you can see, he really handles much of the administrative work for the SharePoint backup installation. So let's look a little bit at his underlings, the backup services themselves. So these are the beat cops out there doing the actual work. So the chief of police sends operations to the primary backup service, and then he delegates the work out to these guys, and these guys actually do the work. So in other words, let's say this far left server here is the database server. The middle two are WFE servers, and the far right is a search server. So obviously the database server backup service is going to be backing up all the database components. The WFE server or WFE server backup services will be backing up those specific WFE relevant components. And then obviously the backup service on the search server will be backing up the search indexes from that particular machine, right? So we do all this leveraging Microsoft's volume shadow copy service technology, which is essentially Microsoft's snapshotting technology, right? It's incredibly fast, incredibly convenient, and really works wonders in terms of getting fast, large, big sets of data backed up in a quick amount of time. So once those backups occur, we store those backup sets to a specified UNC file location of our choice. And we can have multiple locations if we want. Let's say we have specific farm data we need to be stored in one location so that some group of people can access it. And then we want to have maybe all the database content in another location, et cetera, et cetera. Point being, we can set up as many locations as we want. And that's the locations where the actual backed up data gets stored, right? Remember earlier I mentioned it's not in the repository. We get to specify where it is. Well, this is where it is. And we'll see that in context in next week's installation. So the service account that's assigned to this backup service gets full control policy for all the web applications, which gives us access to all the content for backup, or more importantly, for restore. When it gets to the restore step, I mean, at the backup side, we're really doing these snapshots, high level. It doesn't really involve much SharePoint interplay because we're doing OS level components. But when it comes to restoring granular data, we're definitely writing into SharePoint, talking to SharePoint directly, and that's where we're going to need that full control access to the web apps, right? So we've talked a little bit about the primary backup service. Let's talk more about him. So the primary backup service, if we continue with our police chief analogy, so the chief of police gets a request from the user. He sends that order to his primary backup service, his lieutenant, and that lieutenant says, okay, here's what the chief of police wants me to do. He wants me to back up SQL. He wants me to back up the registry on this WFE. He wants me to back up search on this machine. So primary backup services job at that point is to delegate that work to the relevant backup services. He knows that the databases live on the SQL server. He's going to delegate that work to the SQL Server backup service. He knows the search components are on the search server, et cetera, et cetera. I hope that makes some sense. So essentially, he's a second tier of delegation. So the management service definitely delegates the overall job that's requested to the primary, but his job is to granularly dole out that work to the relevant backup services who handle those jobs. So one service out of the bunch is going to act as that primary, and it can be any one of our choice as long as he lives on a WFE. And that will actually change in the future release. But for now, any WFE server in the farm can act as the primary, and he's going to have service order 1 in our repository, which may not be particularly relevant to you now, but in the future, if you're ever troubleshooting issues and trying to figure out where your primary is, there's one good way to do it. We can look in the repository to see what the service orders are. The primary backup service delegates the backup restore operations to other services in the installation, as I've mentioned. From the farm backup perspective, he delegates the work to the various backup services based on what components are hosted on the various backup service host endpoints. Per the analogy I mentioned, right? He knows the SQL stuff is over here, so he sends that operation to him, et cetera, et cetera. On the granular backup side, he delegates operations based on load balancing. And this is really, I leave this note in here because we do have a version of SharePoint Backup out there for SharePoint 2007, wherein this is the truth. But this last note does not pertain to version 5.0 and higher. Okay, so that said, in 4.0, the primary backup service will delegate operations based on load balancing. So in the older version, granular backup is handled by any WFE server, and it's done through SharePoint API calls. And basically, if one WFE is busy doing something, we go to the next one, and so on and so forth. So again, that's kind of to be deprecated, I should say, as 2007 phases out.